I don't really want to coach. Maybe you don't, but getting money is important. And eventually maybe you do courses or maybe you do group coaching, but the thing that you're going to do in the very beginning doesn't necessarily have to be the thing that you're doing forever. Podcast Growth Nation, welcome back to another episode of Podcast Growth University, where we talk all things podcasting all the time. I hope you enjoyed the latest episode. It was episode number 69. Are you using AI, artificial intelligence, as much as you could? We talked about using it as a supplement, not as the main course. Today, for episode number 70, the top 5 lessons from hosting over 1,500 episodes. Yesterday, Alan and I, for Next Level University, we recorded our 1,500th and our 1,501st episode. So technically, if you count the 70 or 69 I had done here, I was already over 1,500, but I wanted to wait until we crossed that mark with Next Level U because I thought it would be a powerful episode to say, look, we started with nothing. We've done 1,500 episodes and we have learned a ton of painful, invaluable lessons over that journey. So today I want to talk about the top 5. When I was thinking of these, I was trying to think from the perspective of a podcast host, someone who lacked confidence in the beginning, someone who didn't really understand time and how that mattered, somebody who didn't understand how practicing something could really, really level you up to the point where you feel really good about what you're doing. So I'm trying to take a multifaceted approach with this. So hopefully you will resonate with what we talk about. I think the 4th one is probably the most valuable one from my perspective, just because it means a lot to me. So we'll dive into it. As you know, I like to just get right into it. All right. Number 1. The number 1 lesson from hosting over 1,500 podcast episodes. If you can last, you can win. I know it probably sounds overly simplistic, but Alan and I were having a conversation yesterday, and we said, how many of the podcasters that we came up with aren't podcasting anymore? And I'm not saying that negatively. I'm not saying they should be podcasting. I'm not saying they're weak for not podcasting, but how many of the people that we started this journey with are still doing the thing that we are doing, or they're still doing the thing that they were doing at the beginning? There's not a lot of people. There's not a lot of people who we started this with that are still as passionate, that are still as consistent, that are still doing the things that they were doing at the beginning. And it's probably not a coincidence that they haven't continued to maintain the level of success that they were on track for. Now, here's a really good example. One of our buddies, Eddie Panero, he has a podcast and a YouTube channel. His YouTube channel is what he started first, but it's called Your World Within. And I think at this point, he might have 800 or 900,000 subscribers. I think he's coming up on 1 million on YouTube. He has remained as consistent as humanly possible, and we've known him for the last maybe 5 years, and he's growing a ton. That's a really good example of if he can last, he can win. He's winning already, and he's going to be just fine. But there's a lot of people out there that probably started a YouTube channel at the same time he did, and they just ended up dying off and saying, well, this isn't going to work. It's not worth it. I can't keep up. If you can last, you can win. There was a post I saw one time on social media, and it makes a ton of logical sense. It makes almost no emotional sense. So I understand why maybe it might not resonate, because I know it wouldn't have resonated with me 5 years ago. But it was something along the lines of, the next 5 years are going to go by anyway. You might as well do what you love. The next 5 years are going to happen. And you might be doing something that's miserable. You might be doing something that you don't enjoy. And that might be a suffer. That might be a struggle. That might be a sacrifice. So imagine if you just did the thing you wanted for the next 5 years and really grinded it out. 5 years are going to go by. You might as well enjoy it. Now, again, I understand that's overly simplified and very, very logical. But if you can last, you can win. If you're doing the same thing that you're doing today, 5 years from today, you're either going to be successful because you're doing the right things, or you're going to be struggling because you're doing the wrong things. Think about it that way. If you met someone and someone said, okay, this person is going to change nothing for the next 5 years, would you bet on their success? I'm willing to bet you'd have a pretty good idea of whether or not they succeed. Same for you. If you can last, you can win. The only reason we are where we are is because we kept going. I don't have a hack. We didn't go viral. We're not going to go viral. I don't have any cheat codes necessarily. I have a lot of experience at this point, but we just kept going. So that's number one. If you can last, you can win. It's not going to happen in year one, most likely. It's probably not going to happen in year two. I don't know if it'll ever actually be a year when it happens. It is the accumulation of the happenings in the years that actually makes the difference. Number two, podcast success is as much leveraging the opportunities you get from the podcast as it is creating a successful podcast. So let me dive into a couple thoughts on this. For a long time, we were mentored by David Meltzer. David Meltzer is a very big figure in our industry, very successful entrepreneur with a net worth of $150 million. He's spoken on stage with all the greats. He's good friends with Gary Vee. He's very, very successful. He also happens to have one of the top business podcasts in the world. We interviewed Dave early on, and our podcast wasn't big. It wasn't successful at that point. We weren't crushing it. We probably had a good amount of listens, but not like we do today. And then we ended up working with Dave, and he coached us for a few years completely free. We met Evan Carmichael, and Evan Carmichael mentored us for some time. We met him through the podcast. A lot of our mentors we met through the podcast. Now we have I believe a 20-person team as of today. And a lot of the team came from the podcast community. A lot of the NLU, Next Level U, core team were listeners of the podcast. So I think what happens is a lot of people think the podcast is going to create the success. So even if you think of it from the perspective of, okay, the podcast is what's going to make me money. Let's just say that. The podcast is where I'm going to learn all my lessons. Okay. What happens outside the podcast is just as important as what happens in the podcast. If you can follow up and leverage the opportunities you're going to get, that's where things really start to compound. So again, the podcast starts and you do it and you get better and you get introduced to people and you make connections and maybe eventually you host your own event. And then it's kind of like starting over. When you host your own event, you start to lose again. You probably lose money. It's really hard to get people there. And then you do that 5, 6, 7, 8 times. And now you kind of have a successful event. And then you do something else. Maybe it's a retreat. And then the same thing happens. The first one's really hard and it gets easier and easier and easier. Your success from your podcast is going to rely a lot on how do you leverage the opportunities that come with the podcast. Because I think a lot of people assume podcast growth equals podcast success. And to a degree, it can, but there's also a lot of opportunity for you to use your podcast as a leveraging tool. I tell clients this all the time. It's easier, if you have a podcast, it's probably easier to get on a podcast as a guest because you have a shared commonality. And if you have 100 episodes or 200 episodes, that is rare. There's not a lot of people statistically that are cranking out 200-300 episodes worth of content. So if you have 300 episodes, podcasters are probably going to look up to you. Therefore, you can use it as a leveraging tool. That's all I mean when I say that. That yes, some success will come from the podcast. Yes, if you continue going, eventually people will reach out and say, hey, I'd like to work with you. Do you have courses? Whatever it may be. But a lot of your success, a lot of your growth, a lot of the breakthroughs are going to be from utilizing the stuff that comes with it, the opportunities. So for us, the opportunities to get coached by Dave and Evan, or the opportunities to go get paid speeches. It's not all because of the podcast. It's how do you use the podcast as a leveraging tool? That would be a big one. And let me just add on that. Well, I'll put that in number 3. So number 3 is having just a podcast usually just isn't enough. Now, I learned that from us, but I've learned that from coaching. I have thousands of hours of coaching at this point, which I'm very, very grateful for. The podcast is just one piece. So if you think to yourself, okay, I'm going to start this podcast and it's going to be everything and it's going to work and this is the thing that's going to drive me to success, we have to check back in with number 2. It's just as much about leveraging, creating and leveraging other opportunities and then going and getting the benefits of those. We did an episode recently on this. I don't remember which one it was. But we did an episode on this recently where we were talking about that. So there has to be more than just the podcast. The podcast is a great thing. It's a great piece. It's a great mechanism, as we talked about. It's awesome. But where do people go? Going back to one of the first episodes we ever did. Where do people go after the podcast? What do they expect while they're here? Why do they tune in while they're here? Where do they go next? It's usually not going to be a purchasing decision. I've just seen the conversion rate from dozens and dozens, probably 100 podcasts at this point. I've just seen the conversion rate of nobody's buying my course when I talk about it on the podcast. That's not a you problem. It is a normal problem. That's just kind of the way it goes. It's just not as good as I think a lot of people are saying. So having just a podcast usually isn't enough. Clients that have podcasts but no social media, the podcast doesn't grow. Clients who have a podcast but don't have a Facebook group, it's not growing at the rate it could. Email list, going on other shows, that type of stuff. It's very, very important. Prospect lists, treating your podcast like a business is always going to be valuable because that's what you're trying to create. If you're trying to turn your podcast into a business, you have to treat it like a business. You have to show up as a business owner. You have to take that level of seriousness with everything that you're doing. So having a podcast is wonderful. One of my favorite things in the world. Having just a podcast usually isn't enough. If we just focused only on the podcast and none of the other stuff, you probably wouldn't be listening to me because I probably wouldn't have this podcast, honestly, because why would I? This isn't our podcast. This is completely different. But this helps our podcast and our podcast helps this podcast. There's so much that goes into it. Now, here's a really good perspective. Having just a podcast usually isn't enough. I don't have any social media for Podcast Growth U yet. I don't have a Facebook group. I don't have a mailing list. Yeah, we have clients, but not from this show. That's from a lot of other things that I've done and a lot of other work that I've done. Having just a podcast, having just Podcast Growth U is not enough. It's actually growing surprisingly quickly, which I'm excited for and I'm grateful for, but it's not because of the work I'm doing outside of the podcast. It just seems like there's, number one, not a ton of podcasts on podcasts, and maybe a lot of people are tuning in from Next Level U. I don't know. Grateful. I'm grateful for each and every one of you. Eternally grateful. But I also realize I'm not doing everything I could to grow this thing. So I want to make sure I throw that out there.
Hey, I wanted to give my experience working with Kevin and the rest of the Next Level University team. It has been such a seamless relationship. He is so easy to work with, Kevin, and he gives you all the information you need, but doesn't overwhelm you. He's also meets you where you're at. So whatever you want to do, he'll make it work. And it's just, there's no stress, there's no drama. And everybody else that I've worked with has been patient with me because I am not technologically savvy. So they've been helpful and patient and just encouraging. And it's just been a fantastic experience. I highly, highly recommend working with them.
All right, number 4, my favorite. You have no idea how talented you can get in 6 years. You have absolutely no clue how much can change, how competent you can be, how much more confident you can be, how much of a better host you can be, how much of a better guest you can be, how intentionally you can speak. I had no idea that I was going to be where I am today 6 years ago. And again, I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but I do believe I'm a pretty strong communicator, all things considered, and I've just been on this mic for so long. I had no idea. In the very beginning, it was, I have to find a way to get to the end of the week. I need to find a way to make enough money to pay rent, to pay my car insurance, to get food. That's what it was like in the beginning. I had no idea what things were going to be like 6 years later. I'm on sales calls and business calls all the time, 20-person team, 55 clients. It's just wild. But all of that is because we try to get a little bit better every single day. A little bit better as a podcaster, as a speaker, as a coach, as a business owner, as a husband, as a leader, as a podcast guest. Don't cut yourself short. If you only do this for a year or 2 years and then call it quits, you're missing out on so much growth and so much opportunity. And you truly have no idea how much can change in 6 years. Again, the only reason you're listening to this is because we didn't stop 2 years in, or we didn't stop 5 years in. If we stopped 5 years in, this show wouldn't exist. So everything that happens after this episode is year 6. We started in 2017. So yeah, we're like 6.5 years in. Everything from 7 years on never would have happened if we stopped before this. Again, I know that's very logical and it's hard. It's potentially hard to balance that or juggle that on the emotional side because it's super logical. But if you can keep going back to point 1, if you can keep going, then you can succeed. We all have that moment where we say, I don't know if this is working. It might not be working in the moment, but it doesn't mean it can't work eventually. Maybe you just haven't built enough momentum yet. You haven't messaged enough people. I know for sure if you stop, it's not going to work. Now, can I guarantee you will be as successful as you want? No. But I do know if you do it for 6 years, you could be more successful than you are today. I have a firm belief in that. I have to believe that. So that is the fourth and probably my most close to home point. I feel completely different than I did 6 years ago. I couldn't imagine doing a solo episode the way I do in my home studio. None of that seemed at all accessible or reachable. So I guess that's kind of a motivational one, but you have no idea how talented you can get in 6 years, in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years. I'm telling you, go back and look at your old content. If you're 52 episodes in, go listen to your first one. I was nervous at the beginning of this because it had been a long time since I'd done a solo episode. It had been 1,000 episodes since I had done an episode by myself with nobody else. Now we're 70 in and I'm starting to feel a lot better, but I still have moments where I lose my train of thought or whatever it is. Just being transparent behind the scenes. All right. Number 5, do what you have to do until you can really focus on doing the most important leverage points. Why did I put this in? Because as an early podcaster or someone who's in the middle level of podcasting, if you don't have a team yet, you got to do everything yourself. So that does become the most important thing. Eventually, you can get to the point where you do the most important leverage points. But in the beginning, everything is the most important leverage point. So again, let's go back to the very, very beginning where we talked about the 5 layers of a podcast business. Social media, podcast, Facebook group, freebie, paid. Start there. Those are going to be the most important leverage points for you for a long period of time. Social media, crush it. Do everything you can to grow. Try not to miss. Try to start conversations with the people who are following you. Comment back. Strategic relationship building, all of that stuff. The podcast, crush it. Try to level up a little bit as you go. New camera, new microphone. Maybe I'll throw some lights. I just got a new light up here. I just got another new light over here. So the studio's a little bit different. Even though we're 1,500 episodes in, I'm trying to get a little bit better. Let's make the studio a little bit better. Maybe new mics. We just got new mics not too long ago, but that type of stuff. The podcast, what can we do to make it better? Always. Facebook group. Okay, yeah, and I've been really dragging my feet. I'm not going to do this Facebook group thing. All right, I got to get in there. I don't know what to post. Well, let me just try posting some stuff. Let me see what happens. Just getting that train rolling is going to be super important. Some sort of freebie. If at some point you want to capture emails, you're probably going to need a freebie. That usually helps. Now, again, even that, mailing list, that's a whole nother conversation. That's a deeper conversation. But for now, taking some time and creating a freebie is going to be valuable. And then paid offering. Doesn't mean you have to be a coach. It doesn't mean you have to have mugs and t-shirts and products and services and courses. Just start thinking of how would you monetize this podcast based on what we've talked about over the last 70 episodes. It's probably not going to be sponsorships and ads and affiliates. It can be, but it's not going to be the same amount as if you did coaching or something like that. I haven't seen any scenario other than these giant shows. But again, those are the anomalies. For every Joe Rogan, there's 1 million shows you've never heard of. For every 1 million shows you've never heard of, there's probably a good percentage of them that are actually making money, not in the way that Joe Rogan is. So let me throw it out there. If you can focus on those 5 things in the beginning and do what you have to do, I don't really want to post on social. That's okay. Eventually, maybe it gets to the point where you can hire a VA. Well, I don't really want to be in my Facebook group. Maybe eventually it gets to the point where you can barter coaching for somebody who's already in there and loves creating a community. I don't really want to coach. Maybe you don't, but getting money is important. And eventually maybe you do courses or maybe you do group coaching, but the thing that you're going to do in the very beginning doesn't necessarily have to be the thing that you're doing forever, but you do have to start that way. You do what you have to do. Audio editing, video editing, social media, until you can really focus on doing the most important leverage points. Then maybe eventually it's going on other podcasts. We went through a phase where we were doing 7 a week for NLU. I was doing 1 a week for PGU. And then I was going on probably 7 others a week. So I was doing as many other shows as I was doing our show or our shows. It was a very important leverage point, and I was able to do that. I was privileged enough to have that opportunity, but it didn't always start that way. Or didn't start that way. It doesn't always start that way. I didn't go on my first podcast until maybe 2 or 3 years in. So I have a lot of catching up to do over the time that I could have. And then I would say the last one, I'll give you a little bonus one. Focus on very, very, very small improvement over time. Going back to, I guess this is kind of all of them in a nutshell. If you can last, you can win. Yes, as long as you're trying to get better. And then going back to the number 4 point, you have no idea how talented you can get in 6 years. If you can just try to get a little bit better, just a little bit better, and try to get rid of the safety nets at times, try to get rid of the crutches. Just as an example, I have been on a lot of shows where they say, I'm not going to do the intro live. I'll do it after. I don't want you to hear me bumbling through it. And while I usually laugh and we laugh about it, I would rather the host butcher the intro 5 times live with me rather than doing it behind the scenes where nobody can see, because it's not helping them get better. I always was terrified to do the intro. I definitely mispronounced people's names. I definitely messed up the intros for sure. But I'm glad I did, because it helped me get a little bit better. We definitely could have edited out likes and ums and buts and interesting. That's something I say very often. But that wouldn't have helped us get better. So if you can focus on getting a little bit better every day as a podcaster, as a speaker, as a content creator, as a coach, whatever it may be, as a team leader, whatever it is, I won't say the sky's the limit, because I think it sounds really good on a fortune cookie, but the opportunity is far greater than you probably understand. Just a little bit better. When we had I kind of wish we still did. I do miss our studio, but we used to have a custom studio that we rented. And it was just a blank room when we rented it. We had an agreement with the leasing company that we could put up whatever we wanted. We could hang stuff on the walls. We had TVs. It was awesome. But every time I'd walk in there, I'd look and say, what if I change this light? Well, the audio quality is not really where I want it. Let me get some curtains and hang those here so it doesn't echo. All right, let's get some sound deadening. Let's get a new TV. Let's get new lights, new camera. It was always something. We were always trying to get a little bit better. And we still are. Over the last couple months, we went through a ton of sound issues we were trying to figure out. And I do believe we figured them out. The new lights in the studio. There's always something. We're always trying to get a little bit better. So if you can try to get a little bit better, you can be really, really good in due time. Those would be the big ones for me. Those would be the big ones. And any of you who listen to NLU, I am grateful. I appreciate you so very much. All of you that listen to PGU, I am grateful. I appreciate you so very much. And even just going to the time perspective, I don't really expect that much this early. 70 episodes in, 70 workouts in, not a lot changes. I'm pleasantly surprised, so I appreciate you all. But even at this point, it's still early. It hasn't been that long. What has it been? 14 months, something like that? So 14 months. It's not that long in the grand scheme of things. So that's another thing, the time perspective. Having 1,500 episodes has allowed me to see that 71, it's not that many in the grand scheme of things. Now, I'm proud. If you've gotten to 20, 30, 40, 50, 70, 100, 200, I am proud of you. I'm not trying to lessen that. But I am saying that you're going to get 71 episodes worth of results probably. And that's okay. Because when you get to 140, you'll get 140. When you get to 210, you'll get to 210. It just takes time. Don't feel like you're the only one dealing with whatever you're struggling with. Don't feel like you're the only one who's going through that challenge right now. I'm sure there are other people who definitely are. And I'm sure there's people who have gone through it, kept going, and now are somewhat on the other side of it. So that is all I would say. That is what I would end with. Again, I'm just grateful. I appreciate you all very much. I know there's a lot of new listeners over here at PGU, 71 episodes or 70 episodes in. So I'm very, very grateful. As always, if you're interested in a free 30-minute podcast breakthrough session, I did a few last week. Click the link in the show notes and you can say, what are 5 other lessons that you learned? What should I do? What do you think of my intro? What do you think of my outro? What do you think of my artwork? Whatever it may be, I'm happy to add value on that. I'm going on the road tomorrow. I'm actually leaving at like 3:30 in the morning, and I'm going to New Jersey and I'm going to Connecticut to see 2 clients in person, help them set up their podcast studios. So that is something I've been doing more of as well, which I love the travel. I can hop in the car, drive down there, get a lot of content. It's a win-win-win. So that's another exciting thing going on. Okay, next week for episode number 71. Why does it seem like people support you less as you do more episodes? We often refer to this, and many people in business refer to this as the chasm. We're going to talk about the chasm and various chasms next week for episode number 71. I hope you are crushing it. I hope your lighting is working. I hope the listens are multiplying. I hope the hosts that you're trying to get on their podcast, they're responding with respect and you're building relationships. And I hope people are seeing the growth, not only in the numbers, not only in you and your skills, but you as a human being. That is what I hope for you all. Until next week, keep on podcasting it. Keep on podcasting. Keep on crushing it. And we will talk to you then.